So we have, and with this particular slide, you'll see on the left, there is a stone wall, and that is the site of Duffy's Cut. A cut is actually a railroad, literally a cutting into a hillside to make a flat railroad bed. And this was at the spot, kind of at the heart of Duffy's Cut. The stone wall was put up by our grandfather's boss, Martin W. Clement, president. He became president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. This was erected in 1909, and our grandfather's boss was working simply as a supervisor in Paoli. And so what happened was this particular area became known as Duffy's Cut because Duffy was the contractor, Philip Duffy. The photo on the right, we'll get into more of that later, but we have a state historical marker, and there's a lot more to it than this. But by way of introduction, I'm going to start this video. This was from CNN, Wolf Blitzer's The Situation Room. And Billy, I think this was 2010? 2010, yeah. So Wolf Blitzer's The Situation Room. It's a good introduction to what we're going to be talking about.
This tucked away in a Philadelphia suburb, a place time has forgotten.
You're looking at a stream that is pretty much as it was in the 1830s.
Brothers Bill and Frank Watson lead us to the site where they are finding bones and skulls, remains of Irish railroad workers. 57 of these immigrants supposedly died of cholera at what's called Duffy's Cut back in 1832. But the Watsons and their team are digging here, convinced something more sinister was at play, a mass murder, and they're unearthing evidence of past violence.
So it's like a CSI case.
Absolutely, it was CSI. This is a murder mystery from 178 years ago, and it's finally coming to the light of day.
The intrigue harkens back to their childhood, when these twin brothers would listen to their grandfather tell ghost stories about Duffy's Cut. He worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. But their smoking gun? A railroad file their grandfather left behind, stating that information about the 1832 deaths be kept confidential. It was enough to prod the Watsons, both historians, to investigate, but they looked for years without finding anything. The site is close to train tracks, covering a broad area.
We have a general guide to work with in the old Pennsylvania Railroad file on this event, but what we needed really was the science, the hard science.
Enter geophysicist Tim Bechtel. He used electric currents to map the area. This diagram shows where he picked up spots believed to be air pockets in the soil, linked to decay of remains.
It really is useful anytime anybody would like to know what's under the ground without digging or drilling. It's not as good as Superman's X-ray vision, but it has the same uses.
And it led the Watsons to what they are looking for now.
And this summer in 2010, we have made 2 more discoveries.
So far, bones of 7 people have been recovered, including 4 skulls, all now in the hands of Janet Monge, a physical anthropologist at the University of Pennsylvania's museum.
If you look at a lot of musket shots on skulls, they're not that little ping that you can see, you know, basically from a modern firearm.
Besides what she believes may be bullet wounds, she's also found evidence of violence in other skulls.
So certainly if they had cholera, that didn't kill them.
One theory that the new immigrants were murdered out of fear they would spread cholera. These researchers are determined to find the mass grave they say will shed light on what they call an historical injustice. Mary Snow, CNN, Malvern, Pennsylvania.
All righty, so the bottom line is Duffy's Cut is the site of a massacre, and as the title of our most recent book states, it's a massacre at Duffy's Cut that took place. 57 Irish railroad workers died of violence. We would probably reverse that, violence and cholera, because there's no, after 180 odd years, there is no sign of cholera. You can't find that somebody died of cholera 180 something years ago. The bacterium, the cholera would die. but there's clear signs of violence in all the bodies that we've recovered. So it's really violence and cholera, even though the railroad said that it was cholera that took them. This image depicting a fanciful depiction of Duffy's cut was from Philadelphia Weekly magazine. I think that was also from 2010, but it literally shows what happened at the site, that there are bodies that are under the tracks. And this was the first case that's been documented of a railroad burial under railroad tracks in the United States. We know that originally this was done to hide these bodies, but eventually the burying of bodies underneath tracks of the laborers was seen as a sign of respect for them, that they were supporting the tracks that they helped to build. But at this point, this was meant to cover up the story, and that's literally what happened here. There was a cover up from the very beginning. But for my brother and myself, really the genesis of Duffy's cut begins for us when we were children. You saw the photograph in the CNN piece of my brother and I on the tracks that's in Villanova. When we were, I guess we were about 4 years old then, and our grandfather, he used to walk us along the tracks and tell us stories of the railroad. And he was an executive. He started off as a yard master in Altoona and worked his way up to executive assistant to a number of presidents and vice presidents of the railroad, eventually ending up as director of personnel management for the whole railroad. But he told us the story of what happened there from the perspective of a ghost story, because that's in the Pennsylvania Railroad file. The images you see on your screen now are from the Pennsylvania Railroad file. The Pennsylvania Railroad created a file starting in 1909 and going all the way to 1932. They collected stories from that era, folks who lived through the events, even at Duffy's Cut. In 1909, there were children of folks who were alive who worked for the railroad, and their children, the adult sons anyway, worked for the railroad. And they told Martin Clement and his colleague, George Sinnickson, what happened from their perspective in August of 1832. So this file that ended up in our grandfather's possession ended up really opening up for us all, really all aspects of where to find the bodies are found here. The geophysics located the X marks the spot, but there was a particular document in this file that told us that they were buried under the fill, and we'll get into that a little later. But this document that my brother and I were led into when we were children, our grandfather told us this story when we were kids, and it's just kind of, when we were adults, it made a huge difference for us, because we wanted to investigate our grandfather's story, and it became a passion. Now, Philip Duffy, born in Ireland, we know that from various census records and other documents, we've done a search of the National Archives, the City of Philadelphia Archives, county archives, all over the place. And we're able to come up with his life story. This is one of the few times where a contractor for the early railroads was able to have his life told from birth to death. We know that when he came to America, it was the year of the Wolf Tone Rebellion in Ireland. And he came with a number of others seeking a new life in a new land. He was a young man at the time. He was just 15 years of age. But we know that in this era, if you didn't have an occupation listed, you were a student or you worked somewhere. You weren't just at home. And he came over as a young lad, and he put his mark on this. In time, Duffy learned how to spell his name, sign his name. He had a beautiful, dramatic lilt to his signature by the time he died. But he went from basically being a laborer to being, on his death certificate, he was listed as a gentleman. He had so much money in his estate that he could list himself as a gentleman. But he was a contractor. He worked out for the railroad on a number of contracts. throughout the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, the earliest commercial railroad in Pennsylvania, sister railroad to the Baltimore and Ohio. We have his contracts. We went out to Harrisburg and we did a full multiple searches of their archives, and we found his contracts for the railroad. Duffy's an interesting character because there are a number of references to his work in newspapers as well. And we know that he generally speaking, always, not even generally, I mean, he always worked with Irish immigrant labor. And at Duffy's Cut, it was no different. In the summer of 1832, Duffy hired 57 laborers. We know that from the railroad file, the Duffy's Cut railroad file. And what's interesting is that we actually, through a search of the National Archives, we found the shipping register, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that later. So we know something about these younger men who came over from the area of Ulster, broad speaking, if you consider Ulster the whole of the north, mostly from the north of Ireland, these folks came. And this image comes to you from the filming of the TV show Death on the Railroad, which was a PBS documentary filmed by Tile Films. In any event, this ship in this particular slide is a bark, a three-masted sailing ship, carried passengers and cargo all over the industrialized world of the earlier 19th century. And this is the Jeannie Johnston. It actually was created as a reproduction of a sailing ship, of a bark. It was also the type of ship that brought the famine folks to North America a decade later, a little more than a decade later. But the John Stamp, you'll see the advertisement on the right slide there, and it sailed for Philadelphia. We know that the ship was actually cholera-free when it came to America. And so while the railroad claimed that these folks died of cholera, locals claimed that they brought it to America. Locals in Chester County said that that foreigners were bringing cholera to the United States. Of course, it came from Europe originally, but these folks, these poor Irish laborers, didn't have a chance because they were pigeonholed, and folks said that they were the ones who brought cholera to Chester County, but they arrived healthy. Port of Derry. This area here, my brother and I had a chance with Earl Shandemeyer, our colleague in Duffy's Cut, to visit Derry several times, and we ended up at the docks where they left. But you see, this is a broad image of Derry. Billy, anything you want to add here about Derry?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's steeped in history, of course. I took that picture out of the back seat of the car because the back seat was where the party was. I wasn't driving.
I was driving. I was the only one who did not have a Guinness in his hand. So
interesting part of the world where you can drink in the car but not drive.
Very fascinating. But it's a beautiful city steeped in history. And these are the docks. I don't know if anybody here who's viewing this, being part of the program today, has been to Derry. But the fascinating thing is that Bill and I and our friend Earl, we were able to go down to this dock, the remains of the dock. It's now basically a historic site, and you'll see the Port of Derry. They have ships, and there are fishing boats to go out from there. The Queen gets a certain percentage of every fish caught on the Foyle River. So it's a fascinating history there. But it's amazing that this actually, it's still a working marina. The John Stamp ship list we found in the National Archives here in the United States, 160 passengers, 100 men, 60 women, boys 15 years up, all had an occupation listed, and they were laborers. It's hard to imagine that if you're 15 years of age, you were almost, most of these young boys were hired as laborers when they came over. Type of work they did was backbreaking. And you would not, if you were a slave owner in this era, you wouldn't hire your slaves to do this work because it was so dangerous. So generally speaking, in this early period, it was the Irish. Sometimes the railroad sent representatives to Ireland and recruited. Down on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, they hired both the Irish and the Germans. And because the Irish drank whiskey and the Germans drank beer, they came to America at a time when the temperance movement was on the rise, and they were all stereotyped as being drunks. But of course, if all they drank was whiskey or beer, they would have lived through the cholera epidemic quite well. But Bill will get into some of that. Bill, you want to take over the next part here? And we'll do the screen sharing so that you can.
Oh, okay. All right.
Let me see.
So if you X out.
Yep. Here it is. There you go.
All right. So let me minimize this. Bring this up. And then I'm going to go back here. Oops. I'm going to go back here. What the hell is this? Ah, there we go. Enlarge that. Share screen. And let's see what we got. Share. All right. So I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit in my presentation. I'll just do it manually here. Well, Frank talked about the way we got into this, the idea that this came from this file that was preserved by our grandfather. The item in the middle here is from when the Pennsylvania Railroad had merged with the New York Central and then collapsed. And there was an enormous amount of material, historical material from the railroad from the earliest days when it was the Philadelphia and Columbia, as well as the Pennsylvania Railroad, that went up for auction. And this is the auction book. Miscellaneous bundles of documents, all kinds of internal history of the railroad in Pennsylvania went up for auction, but not this file, because our grandfather chose to get it out of the vault before it went up for auction. He retired as the director of personnel, the one and only in the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad before the merger with the New York Central, and had been the unofficial historian for 4 presidents of the railroad. And so he was allowed to take what he wanted before it went up for auction. And it was very fortunate for the Duffy's Cut story that file was not in the miscellaneous bundles of documents, because it could have ended up in someone's collection on the other side of the country. So let me, the fortunate aspects here also of being hired fairly close to the site. The acquisition of the state historical marker was our first step. And that did take quite an effort. I don't know if any of you guys have been involved in acquiring a state historical marker. It does have something to do with the patronage system in Pennsylvania, so that each state congressional district, can get one of these in the course of a year. And there's competition actually to get these things. So we got the assistance of a lot of groups, outside groups. The Chester County Emerald Society, Irish police officers in Chester County, several politicians, including Andrew Dinniman, who was then a Westchester councilman, later state senator, and state senator at the time, John Rafferty, as well as the East Whiteland Township officials. And so we managed to get this marker, but it was a battle. We had a petition with several thousand signatures on it. But this was stage 1. So we got the story recognized in the state. This is the letter on the left that we got from Barbara Franco from the Historical Commission, from the Marker Division. And the center picture is when we dedicated the marker. And it really only took 2 months before we got it in the ground. It's at the intersection of King and Sugartown, and it's visible to anyone who passes into Malvern, East Whiteland area, Willistown area, and a very high traffic area. And we were fortunate when we got this, that the police chief in Willistown was a friend, and he said that we can put it up on the corner of the intersection that is in Willistown. It's hard to imagine that that's Willistown and not the other side of the road, but it's where East Whiteland, Willistown, and Malvern all come into conjunction. And the property owner there had to be informed, and it just so happened to be the case that the guy who owned this property, it's set off from the property, close to the curb, but still on his property. He happened to be the cook at Immaculata, so it was kind of convenient. But getting that in the ground was for us the first step. Getting permission to dig was a whole other thing. We had an idea from the beginning that this wasn't going to just be an archival project, but an archaeological project. And then, therefore, as historians, we needed to enlist the support of people in a lot of different areas, eventually getting an archaeologist and a physical anthropologist in, and so on. Most of those connections coming from the University of Pennsylvania, where I had contacts in my grad school years. I got my PhD from Penn. And so we got the okay from the state to dig there, and then trying to get someone to guide the dig, was a whole other thing. But nobody cared about this at the beginning. Everybody thought we were crazy. We weren't going to find anything. Eventually, Mark Schaefer sent us this permission to dig, and he came out actually 2020, right before the pandemic. There's now a file delayed by many years on Duffy's Cut in the State Historical Society, the Pennsylvania Museum and Historical Commission's archaeological file on what we've done at the Cut. So with their approval, but this was it was a long process of evolution to get this project moving, and bringing in various and sundry individuals, as you'll see in a moment, going to be critical to that. But even before we found the skeletal remains, and we were bringing in groups of volunteers to help us with the archaeology, it struck a chord in Ireland. We've subsequently found out that there are probably about 20,000 Irishmen who died building the industrial infrastructure of the United States in the 1820s and the 1830s, very early, a lot before the famine years. And most of these Irish immigrants are recruited specifically for canal or railroad work. And including the Duffy's Cut crew would have been recruited from their home country to come over here by a sponsor, someone like Philip Duffy. But most of those individuals who died building the Erie Canal down to the New Orleans Canal and everything in between, including the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, which is Pennsylvania's first railroad, second in North America. Most of the people who died building these things and are buried anonymously along the track lines, along the canals, will never be known. They're the common man, typical common man. No one's going to know anything about most of these people, even though there may be markers here and there saying that there were mass burials in the Erie Canal or on the C&O Canal or the B&O Railroad or whatever. Most of these individuals will never be known. This offers a unique opportunity to know the lives of the common workers, because of the fact that the railroad file that Frank referred to has the specific time of the arrival of the workers. And so it's a matter of going down to the National Archives, and we were able to figure between June 1st and October 1st of 1832, there's one ship that had a substantially large number of laborers, and that's the John Stamp. So we go from that, and the first book that we brought out was in 2006, the year that the first Tile Films documentary was made, The Ghost of Duffy's Cut. They both had the same name because there's a folklore of supernatural happenings associated with this, and a large number of those other mass graves as well. Tile Films came back in 2013 and filmed again after we'd found the skeletons. And The Ghost of Duffy's Cut was the most popular documentary, historical documentary in the history of RTE, Irish State Television, at that point.
And nominated for a slew of awards. You know.
It's because so many people in Ireland have stories of individuals who came over here and vanished from the family tree. So finding out who these people were was one of these important early archival pieces. And the average age is 22. From the excavated remains that we would find, the average height was about 5'6". Typical for the time. Even Napoleon was not short, he was about 5'5", which was typical for the time. People were shorter. The other information about Duffy, Frank mentioned, we've got the house that he was renting in 1830, 1832 time frame with a large number of laborers with him. Many of these would have been working with him on mile 9 of the Westchester Railroad. Would have been fairly close to where the historical marker is for Duffy's Cut today. That line, of course, the original Westchester line is now defunct, but there are little traces of it, just as there are with the P&C, the Philadelphia and Columbia, around the main line area. Among the artifacts that we found, these are, by the way, on display in our museum, which is open at Immaculata in the Gabriel Library any day that the university is open. We're going back to full-time classes in person on Tuesday next week, so you can feel free to reach out, and I can meet you over in the library. It's no problem. Frank and I can meet you. I can meet you. My office is right across the lawn from the museum. But this is a stem of a pipe from Derry, the port of departure of the John Stamp. And so, from a historian's perspective, when we found this in the shanty area in the Fill, south of the Fill, in the valley, where we knew that the guy's material remains would be fairly close to here. This was context. This was absolutely important because this is the city of departure of the ship, the John Stamp, and the fact that the Fill didn't exist prior to 1832. Bodies couldn't have been buried there before 1832 because there was no Fill. And it couldn't have been buried there after the opening of the rail line because it's an active rail line. We knew then that they had to be buried somewhere in the Fill. This is about 30 feet south of where the Fill is located. And the valley was never occupied by later work crews. They lived at Garrett Siding in Fraser. By around 1870, the reconstruction of the track line by the Pennsylvania Railroad. We find out that most of these workers came from the Ulster area of Donegal, Tyrone, Derry, and the north of Ireland, where you have a lot of sectarian issues stemming from the Protestant settlement at the time of the Stuarts, and where the troubles continued, of course, until the 1990s, lessening the impact of the Industrial Revolution as it would emerge in cities like Belfast for the Catholics, who were literally at the bottom of the social and the economic hierarchy. And in the case of the workers at Duffy's Cut, we know that they were building the Fill. They were literally at the bottom of the track line. We only found out last year as a result of documents that we had scanned and saved, but so many documents we couldn't look at. Finally, figured out who finished the top of the track line. And it was the McCartney brothers, Protestants from County Down, who had a Protestant Irish work crew who did not die in the epidemic, who are not reported to have perished. No violence was reported to have been done to them. And they continued to get contracts. They were very good friends with William Mitchell, the engineer who ran the Eastern Division of the Philadelphia and Columbia. And
He was also from Northern Ireland.
yeah,
William Mitchell was also from Northern Ireland.
yeah. So that the example of the Belfast dockyards, where the Catholics were working literally at the bottom of the boats as they were ships as they were being built, and the Protestants working at the top. This is referenced in a lot of books about the Northern Ireland economy. The exact example of that occurred at the Cut, where the Catholics are working at the bottom and the Protestants up top. It's really remarkable. Frank talked about the impact culturally, Duffy, some of these things as well. Getting the permissions to dig, getting the interest of the powers that be, the unions very strongly favored what we were doing. East Whiteland Township supervisors favored what we were doing. Walt Hunter, CBS crime reporter, latched onto this at the very beginning and got the word out there. And his presence in doing stories for KYW TV and radio brought in a lot of people to volunteer their services, which we could not otherwise afford because we had no money coming in. But it was Tim Bechtel who got on the scene here in 2008, who was really going to be the critical factor in finding the skeletal remains. The archaeology, we had groups like the Greater Philadelphia Search and Rescue, the Bravo team, Battlefield Restoration Associates, coming out and helping us with the archaeology, but the metal detectors aren't going to help with skeletal remains. So we needed ground penetrating radar. And as you saw in the little clip by Tim Bechtel, how we found those skeletal remains is by looking at it for a stopping void where something was solid in the ground, deteriorates, collapses at the bottom, and leaves a layer of soil above it that would be a clear indication that there had been a body buried in that spot. And he had had prior experiences in battlefields, including French and Indian War battlefields out western end of Pennsylvania. The bottom left illustration here shows the scale of the fill as it is today. It would be elevated probably about 50 feet from the time of the men working there in the past and widened to accommodate more modern trains. But you can see on the south side that the stream view on the left side is from the north. The right side here is the south side in the valley surrounded by a housing development and pretty much untouched since 1832, where we would find, as a result of Tim's radar, what we were looking for. We also found in the course of the archaeology this pipe bowl that has the Erangel Bra flag on it, the time of the United Irishman Revolt when Philip Duffy came over in 1798. That was the flag, and it says on here, Flag of Ireland. And we've been told that this is the oldest example of Irish nationalism in North America, specifically designating a flag for the country before it was an independent country until 1920. But the archaeology here on maps, this is discussed in our book, Massacre at Duffy's Cut. The Greater Philadelphia Search and Rescue Crew in the photo on the lower left there had search dogs scent something organic. It was an unused grave filled with a lot of artifacts, would have been raked in there by Duffy's Iron Man,
Blacksmith.
Malachi Harris. The little yellow in the map on the left, upper left, shows where almost all the artifacts were found. And the undulating terrain to the right of that is where the fill still existed from the old days of the railroad, because the track line slowly shifted to the north, and you can see the modern track line on this map. This was provided by the homeowners. The detail of the square is over here in the illustration on the right. Again, also discussed in more detail in our book, but very rare, very unusual artifacts from the earliest days of the railroad, implements from the digging of the fill, and then personal items of the men themselves, which is again fairly unique because they're common individuals, and most of this stuff wouldn't have survived. Would have been recycled, would have been taken by other people, but because these guys were thought to have had cholera, and the first 7 whom we excavated, of course, were killed, as Frank said. The superstition, the fear of contagion, they were buried with things that in some cases would have been unthinkable to bury with someone at the time. The Barlow knife, for example, on the right here, would have been in the right-hand pocket of the man who was buried and stuck under a tree. So the archaeology finding the remains here, this is Tim Bechtel's thing. And once he found the first set of remains here in this image in 2008, which we excavated in right after St. Patrick's Day, March 20th of 2009, Tim got Janet Monge, the physical anthropologist from the Penn Museum, and her assistant, Samantha Cox, an anthropologist and archaeologist, to run the dig. And so the first set of remains you see in the photo here, Janet came out, looked at him, and she said it was an approximately 18-year-old male, and he had been hit on the head, perimortem, time of death, blow to the head that probably caused his demise. And she found all kinds of interesting things about him, that he had a right ear infection that had never healed. His height, and his physical state at the time of death, very strong. You could tell the musculature from the bones. And then over the next couple of years, finding 7 skeletons here. The AP photo in the middle shows us on the field in the early stages of the excavation. Another subsequent radar image from Tim Bechtel showed a cluster of 5 skeletons under a 180-foot tall tulip poplar. And you can see in the photo on the upper right, the team that was assembled. A number of these are my students, Frank and Earl and myself. John Ottes by that time had passed away in 2010. He was there when we found SK00 That's the skull right here that we excavated, but then he passed away, unfortunately, before we excavated her. And the guy in the far left in that group photo, Bob Frank, who's now our IT guy at Immaculata, is my former student. He's making more money than me in IT. Was the guy who helped me excavate SK07. Well, Frank and Earl excavated SK06. Both of these skeletons were very interesting. They were located farther to the west of the cluster under the tree, and we suspect that there were more of these skeletons. And Tim Bechtel suggested that they were no longer there after 1870 because that portion of the fill was sloughed off to make the expansion of the tracks go to the north, to make the fill larger to accommodate heavier locomotives, and that they would have been moved to their location under the stone monument. The interest of the Irish government in this, immediately the ambassador came out, several consuls general, the Irish president, the Irish prime minister. We don't have his picture here, but Enda Kenny, because of course these are individuals who came from a kind of unfinished story, because Ireland is still a divided country. Even if these, the number of them came from Donegal, but the others from Donegal are from Tyrone and Derry are in Northern Ireland and the UK. Sinn Féin has taken a particular interest in our work as well because of that reason, the political aspects of the unfinished story of Irish history. But the forensic stuff here, the forensic dentist we brought in, who Matt Patterson had worked with the U.S. Navy to ID GI remains, and he found a very interesting anomaly in the first skeleton we excavated. John Ruddy, aka John Ruddy, the 18-year-old on the ship list, that he was born with a 1 in 100,000 dental anomaly called an M1A genesis. And when the story hit the press that we found a skeleton with this, there were people from Northern Ireland contacting us, especially in Donegal, which is in the Republic, named Ruddy, who also have this rare dental anomaly. And so one of the things that's an unfinished part of our project is to get the funds to finally get the DNA done to definitively link this set of remains with those Ruddys today who are missing their right top front molar. The suggestion is clear, that they have the same last name as this set of remains, and we want the proof, and they want the proof, and it'd be something that'd be kind of neat. But the money has eluded us. The guy on the right here, Frankie, do you want to take over for this guy?
Yeah, you're talking about the one who was shot in the head.
Yeah, the tall guy.
Yeah. So SK006, as we call him, or the tall man. Fascinating thing, because the first piece of him that we found was a part of his right arm, the forearm, and then as we slowly scraped away at the very edge of that, we came in from the side. We found part of his skull, and what's amazing is once we excavated the body, this man had multiple blows to his head and a bullet hole on top of it. The image in the kind of the orangey greenish image is a scan of his skull taken at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital rather. And Janet Monge had that done to confirm several things. But the first, really, if you'll see the image on the upper right, it's actually a hole that is a bullet hole. There was a part of the bullet in his skull. The scan taken at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital on the lower right shows fragments of that bullet. And so he was basically buried. When we reburied him, we buried him with a bullet inside of his skull. For those, there have always been folks who have wondered about the extent of these deaths. This meets the criteria of a mass murder at so many levels. We have seven people who were murdered And these bodies show extensive remains of blunt force trauma. The crack that's in the middle of that skull, in the lower middle there with the orange and green coloring on it, that was an axe blow that Dr. Janet Monge showed us would have been he would have been hit from behind by a right-handed person with an axe, and then finished off with a bullet in his skull. And likely because he was a very tall man, he was close to 6 feet. And the reality is that none of the individuals we found showed any signs of defensive wounds. So Dr. Monge pretty much laid out the case for the fact that these folks were tied up before they were murdered.
She said that if they had cholera, that's not what killed them.
Yes, it's a horrible, horrible picture that's painted here, but this is the truth, and we have to, as researchers, the truth is not always pleasant. We have to tell the story as it played out. I serve as a Lutheran archivist in New Jersey, and I'm also president of the Lutheran Archive Center in Philly. And we went from archives, our grandfather's file, and the archives literally at the Free Library of Philadelphia, the Harrisburg State Archives, county archives in Chester County, federal archives, all over we went from archives to finding these bodies. And it was just, I think I can speak for Bill here and for our colleague and friend Earl. We never thought that we would be at that point when we first started this. But it's a story that told itself. Each bone we uncovered, each piece of evidence in that valley that we uncovered told a story that, sad to say, was not that uncommon in that era, especially of cholera victims. Cholera victims,
yeah, and in these
were
cases,
often isolated.
Yeah, in these cases, let me just interject here that the reasons for killing these guys, it would have been fear of the spread of the disease, an unknown disease that nobody had any idea about transmission for another 50 years after Duffy's cut. It wasn't until the 1880s, this is fully understood, even though, before that, maybe 20 years later, John Snow had the idea. It wasn't until Dr. Koch, I can't remember his first name right now, found the microbe, in a microscope. So that this was an unknown disease. But it was another aspect of this was that these guys were cheap labor, that they were coming in and displacing people at the bottom of the manual labor scene, and working for possibly 25 cents a day, possibly even less than that. And they would have been resented. And there's lots of instances around the country in the 1830s of scenarios like this happening. The nascent nativism, it's going to become such an important part of the country's history in the years ahead, was on the scene at this time. We had a book that we used for an NEH Teachers Institute at Immaculata on Duffy's Cut back in 2016 called Apes and Angels, depictions of the Irish in America and in the UK at the time. And, it's a kind of social Darwinistic perception of these guys as somewhat subhuman to begin with. A, because of the fact that they're not speaking English, many of them would have been speaking Gaelic. B, because they're Catholic, and there were almost no Catholics in East Whiteland where the work was taking place in 1832. I mean, there were 900 people total in East Whiteland in 1832. There was no church out there at that time. Someone called on the Sisters of Charity to come out and help these guys. We don't know who. 4 of them would have come out, we believe, after the first ones were murdered and after the last, before the last ones were buried there. And they were hastened out of there before they could really do much of anything. That's referenced in the railroad file and preserved by the Sisters of Charity. There were several Sisters of Charity orphanages in Philadelphia at the time, St. Joseph's and St. John's. And the city called upon the sisters to bring more of their number to Philadelphia. I think there were a total of about 12 or 13 of them in Philadelphia serving in the cholera hospitals at the time, because nursing as a profession broke down. Scene of utter and complete chaos anywhere where cholera hit. About 150,000 people officially died of it around the world, 10,000 in the United States. But that's a fraction of the numbers who actually died in the epidemic. Those are official numbers. And we know in Pennsylvania that there's another Irish mass grave of railroad workers in Downingtown, we'll get to at the end here, and then canal workers in Spring City. None of those guys ever got counted in totals, and nor did the men at Duffy's Cut. But getting the story out there, you know, our role in pushing this story is to get the understanding that the Industrial Revolution in the United States wasn't just a bunch of statistics that you see in the textbooks. There's a lot of people who suffered in the building of this great country of ours, and that these are men who would have otherwise been anonymous, and they're not anymore. Those are that chance survival of the file, the survival of the ship list that has the passengers' names, where they came from, their ages, their occupations, what they brought with them. In many cases, was almost nothing. You know, poor guys, age 22. You know, with literally nothing in the world and no opportunity back in Ireland, you know, working on a farm for an absentee landlord versus coming over and making no money. I mean, they could not make money in the economy in the Industrial Revolution and anywhere in Ireland at the time. And so here you go, you know, this shining beacon on the horizon, come over here, and lo and behold, you got the same kind of situation of exploitation as you got over there. But West Laurel Hill Cemetery was going to come forward and offer. Walt Mail was one of their workers at the time. He got us in to see the president, offer grave space. So here is another spot for the Duffy's Cut story. West Laurel Hill Cemetery, which has a lot of railroaders buried there. And Immaculata had a fundraiser and then kicked in the other 16,000 for the tombstone, which is at the bottom, a ledger with the names, and then the Celtic cross. And so we buried 5 of them here, and then we took 2 back to Ireland because we were able to ascertain their names. We piped their students were the pallbearers. We had an auxiliary bishop, and Bill Dorn. This is Bob Frank handing the caskets down to Bill Dorn. Bill Dorn made the coffins. Frank, you want to talk about it a little bit?
Sure, yes. When we went to Ireland in 2013, it was really kind of a crazy scenario because that casket that's on the third image from the left, that little casket, we carried that with us onto the plane. We had to get permissions, you know, basically to get the bones over to Ireland. And that was a fascinating thing because one day between 2 of us, Bill and I think you contacted the New York Consul General. I contacted the embassy in DC, and because the Irish government thought that these bones, once they were shipped over, was going to compromise the health of Irish people. Somehow that the cholera that might have been present in that first man, John Ruddy, would have still been alive was absolutely absurd.
It was extortion. They wanted $1,000. It would have cost $1,000 to carry him in a coffin on the plane. And so we shipped him over for $300 at the University of Pennsylvania, is customary, via UPS. But at the Dublin airport, they were holding him up in customs that he was going to be harmful to Irish soil. He's an Irishman after all, but whatever. He got out of quarantine at the Irish airport. And then Vince Gallagher, the guy in the lower, I'm sorry, because when this is my slides, Frankie would have some pictures of him and some of these guys. I'm sorry, Frank. Anyway, Vince Gallagher, the guy in the lower left photo with the suit, he's the guy who got us the grave, his family grave in Ardra in County Donegal. And the whole town came out.
It was amazing.
Our state television covered it, and here's the grave. So
Yes.
we do have a video of.
Yeah, why don't you show the video from RTE?
Yeah, let me do that. So I will stop share here, and then I will go to the video and start share there. And it should be right in here. Okay, so I'm gonna have to. Hold on a second. Whoops, I gotta pause it.
You want me to show it? I actually have it.
Yeah, I mean, I got it here. It's here. I got to enlarge it, but I got to pause it. Let me take it back. Let me pause it. And then I got to hit share. I got to get up here big and then share screen. And then here it is. Okay, so can you hear it?
If you can increase the volume would be good.
Derry, Tyrone and Donegal who found employment on a railroad near Philadelphia. The men had been in America for only 6 weeks when cholera broke out. It is believed that the 57 men were murdered by fellow railroad workers who feared that the Irish men were spreading disease.
Vincent Gallagher thought it would be appropriate that John Ruddy should be reinterred in his own county, and he offered his grave here beside the chapel behind me. It's an interesting day and a bit exciting as well, and a bit unusual. I suppose he's going to be the oldest man ever buried in Ardra at 198.
Today, the research team from Immaculata University accompanied his remains to Ardara, where a grave had been provided. A crowd had gathered to pay their respects to a young man killed 181 years ago.
We'll hopefully have 50 more of them to bring home by the end of the year if we can do it. So, we're really looking forward to seeing if we can make sure that these guys get treated properly. We're hoping that we can shed some light on the incident at Duffy's Cut. I mean, it's been in the dark for so many years. Nobody's known anything about it.
While John Ruddy's tale has come to an end, work is still ongoing in America to identify and repatriate the remains of those buried at Duffy's Cut. Ní Breslan, RTE News in Ardara and County Donegal.
Okay.
Can I just add something? 2 seconds. We actually, my brother and I and Earl Shandelmeyer are styled by the coroner in Chester County as the legal guardians of these remains. So when we placed his body into the earth, which was in that little video clip, we were doing so as members of his family. Basically, we're considered his guardians as his family. And it's just such a fast, it was low. We didn't know we were going to do that until we were there at the grave. And they pointed to us and said, okay, now you lower him into the ground. It was like, whoa. But
there's his stone. There's his stone.
Yeah.
There are Irish tour groups that go there, including one that my allergist went on and brought it up. She had been in Ireland because she knew that I was a bagpiper. She didn't know I was involved in Duffy's Cut. And she said, we found this grave on this bus tour way up in Ardara, and it was an American Irishman, blah, blah, blah. I was like, oh my gosh, yeah. So that's kind of neat. The other individual we were able to take over, this is Brian McCall, who was friends with Vince Gallagher. Vince Gallagher founded the Commodore Barry Club, the Irish Center in Philadelphia. And Brian is, like Vince, an Irish immigrant. Vince is from Donegal. Brian is from Tyrone. That's the county where Catherine Burns came from. Now, there can be no other woman in the world buried at Duffy's Cut in 1832 other than Catherine Burns, because the age that Janet Munn said is approximately 30, and Catherine Burns on the passenger list is 29. And the overwhelming interest in this in Tyrone, it's a part of the UK, it's part of Northern Ireland province, was as large or larger than for John Ruddy was. And Father Benny Fee, he's now Canon Benny Fee, held a wake for her the night before the burial. That was it was overwhelming. The entire parish was there, and it was astounding. We didn't think
the hordes of people who were there it was unbelievable.
Yeah, and we had we'll a few more slides here, but we'll conclude with Father Fee's segment in his sermon that is very pertinent to why we did this and why we're continuing to try to do this. That it kind of gets in your blood, and you've got to see it through to conclusion. Now, there are another 50 guys buried at the cut. And so we started work in the fall of 2015 trying to get to them. There was a contractor named Joe DeVoy, who's had an interest in Duffy's Cut and got Amtrak's permission through Capitol Hill. He got us into the Friends of Ireland Committee and House Transportation Committee, and they gave the word down the Amtrak that we should be allowed to work here. And Tim Bechtel got us an image, and then Joe DeVoy went out and did these core samples in the wrong area. It was really a shame. He spent a lot of money on this, but the two were not there at the same time. And so Joe DeVoy lost interest. And so next thing we did was a Duffy's Cut Institute, where we brought in about 30 teachers to get this into the high school curriculum. And John Hankey, who had been the guy who was predicting where the bodies were, a specialist in the 1830s railroad out here in Strasburg, is discussing with the teachers. Tim Bechtel here, showing them how archaeology works. Janet Monge and Samantha Cox talking about how physical anthropology works. And so getting the story out there in a variety of ways has been key for us. A lot of different kinds of books have discussed Duffy's Cut, everything from supernatural because of the folklore to histories of the railroad, histories of Chester County, histories of the pandemic, the histories of the church, and several novels. Red Sky and Morning was the first. There have been at least two others. I've got over on my shelf in the back. I won't bother getting those as props, but it's made an impact musically as well. We have a CD, which if you have a CD player, we can get to you through our website, www.duffyscutproject.com. Lots of musicians have made some very important pieces of music about Duffy's Cut that tell the story as well as any historical narrative. One of the most recent things is the accurate sign above the stone monument. Now, this was Amtrak employees who wanted to do this, and the Ancient Order of Hibernians, Division 25, got this sign up there, and so we helped them put that in the ground in October of 2017. A lot of art as well. Frankie, do you want to talk about the paintings?
Sure. We had an opportunity to participate in a television show that had been produced on the history of Irish Philadelphia that ended up being shown to the Pope when Pope Francis came to the United States. And the artist who did the artwork here, Fred Danziger, did an amazing job. They had, in addition to live action actors, they also had these almost like 3D images that were used to illustrate parts of the Duffy's Cut story. And the one on the left and the one in the middle are two of the images of the Duffy's Cut piece of the Urban Trinity television show. And we were able to acquire these, all of them. I think there are 6 of them, and they all came through to us. We were able to buy them because Fred wanted us to have them for our museum, but through the generosity of the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, it's one of the oldest Irish fraternal societies. It includes in its membership both Protestants and Catholics. I am one of the chaplains, and I'm the membership chair as a Lutheran. So that's kind of a cool thing. But they've been very generous in their support, and so we were able to acquire these paintings. The other piece here on the right is one of a series, I think of 4. I think we have 4 of those, and it was done by an artist who is likely related collaterally to one of the victims at Duffy's Cut. And the funny thing is, she's also related to my old church organist from my previous parish, which is just this bizarre, weird twist. When we posted this, I'm still in touch with my former organist, and he got back to me and he said, "Oh my gosh, that's my cousin from Pittsburgh." And so when
Murphy
premiered, yes, Ann Murphy. So when she came out to West Laurel Hill Cemetery, one of our memorials, to show these to the world, and we had copies to prints of these that we're able to sell for the benefit of the Duffy's Cut project. I introduced him with her, and it was this crazy family reunion time. You never know. There were wheels within wheels in this project. And of course, in our daily lives that, we as Christians, we know that this happens. But right, Billy, it was one of those crazy, weird connections.
Well, there's so many connections like that. Tim Bechtel and Matt Patterson are cousins. We got Tim Bechtel in on this because of the assistance of Drew McGee, who's a retired physics professor at the time. When we got Tim in on this, was actively teaching at Penn and had a Saudi Fulbright guy who was staying at Immaculata down at the Penn Museum. And there was another guy in our history department who's never been very sympathetic to what we're doing here, who said, "Oh, it's an urban myth." And then Drew McGee told me that, and I said, "Drew, do you understand why it's an urban myth at this point? Their bodies are because we don't have money to pay for a geological survey." And he says, "I got the guy for you." And bingo, Tim Bechtel came on and found the skeletons. And you got Matt Patterson, you got Janet Monge, you got Samantha Cox. These little connections. The fact that Walt Hunter knew our grandfather.
Yeah, that's crazy too.
And so the most recent story here is Massacre at Duffy's Cut. It supersedes the original book, although it's different than the other book, because this came out after we had found skeletal remains, and the other one came out before we found skeletal remains. The other book is still a good book. It's just it's different because we hadn't yet completed that part of the story, but it was important to get this out. We had to get this book out because of the various questions that have come up. What did you actually find? Now, there have been articles. It depends on the readership, of the journal or the magazine, whether or not that word was out there. So we had to get this book out. And so that is available also through Amazon. It's at Barnes & Noble. And there's a link through our website. We have a store where you can get these pictures. You can get the CD. You can get the book. You can get T-shirts. And hats. Let me just see. Is there another slide there? Now the next one, I think this is our last slide, and this was a fairly controversial thing. Again, sorry, Frankie, I got the picture. That's my slide thing, so I got the two pictures. But they had me drop the soil on his grave. Bill Doran made a coffin for Philip Duffy when we found out that Philip Duffy's grave. When we knew Philip Duffy's grave was located at St. Anne's back in Frankie. What year was that? 06?
That would have been 2005, I think.
2005. And
Yes.
Catholic Church, Lehigh Avenue in Memphis.
Yes. So it was someplace that we knew had an old lineage, a lot of old Catholic graves there. I had an inkling playing there before this could be where Philip Duffy was because we weren't able to find him anywhere. And then
we found him in the city archives, though.
Yeah.
We found him in the 1870 census. Listed as a retired contractor in Port Richmond, and we went down to the Philadelphia City Archives, and we found his death record that he was buried here. The thing is that no headstone had been put in place after he died, and the priest, Father Skip, who was there at the time, I think he's still there. Said that he learned that there was no headstone placed on his grave because folks were scared that it would be desecrated, because he was not the nicest of people. Philip Duffy used his workers, covered up the story, and it was only after he died that the Duffy's Cut story was told among the railroad population in public. The first fence was put up after he died at the site of their death. The first stories were written down after he died. He was a powerful man. He was the Democratic commissioner for the to elect a railroad commissioner for the county of Philadelphia. He had statewide connections. He was involved in politics. He was on boards and committees. He was a maker and a shaker, and he had two twin sons who were bruisers. They were called the Battling Duffy Twins. And they were amateur boxers and Irish musicians, born in America, of course. But he had these two bruisers living with him, and nobody sullied his reputation or even talked about that story until he died. And so this was very significant. Even though Duffy's not a hero in the story, it's important to know, in this day and age anyway, this part of the tale, that he's buried in this particular spot, right, Bill?
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is that there was blowback. I'm Catholic, and I'm in the Ancient Order of Hibernians, Blackjack Kehoe Division down here in Delaware County. That a lot of the AOH guys says, why are you guys supporting the reburial, or not the reburial, but the tombstone on the grave of a guy who was probably an asshole? And yes, I don't think very highly of Philip Duffy. He left the men there to be anonymously buried in the Phil. He certainly didn't do anything to preserve their memory, but
And he
It-
didn't
it's
allow
an-
didn't allow anybody to talk about it.
Yeah.
Which
So,
is-
but history is the good, the bad, and the ugly, and you have to tell his story if you're telling the story of Duffy's Cut. The place is named after him, after all, and the parish where he's buried is an Irish Catholic parish going back to the early 1800s, and it's a place that should be incorporated into the bigger picture of Duffy's career and of Duffy's Cut. And so we thought it was important. We helped them. We helped them get the stone, and is part of the story, not to exalt Philip Duffy, but to bring that part of the story together. And everybody deserves a stone. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe Hitler and Stalin don't, but I mean, does Duffy deserve a stone? You know, I mean, I don't. I think he does. I mean, I don't know. It's important for the parish. It's important for the Irish community in Port Richmond to understand that they're part of a bigger network of Irish labor across the state. And Duffy had, the reason why he was there is because this was very heavily a Reading Railroad neighborhood. And his last contracts were with the Reading Railroad. He had contracts with the Philadelphia and Columbia, the Westchester, the Reading Railroad. God knows overall.
Pennsylvania Railroad later.
Yeah, God knows how
thing.
many he actually had.
Yeah, and then he had contracts with the city of Philadelphia. He was on the committee. He was a commissioner for what was called the Arrow-Mingo Canal, that tried to bring traffic and commerce and industry into the Port Richmond area. He was a maker and a shaker. He was not a nice guy, but still, to remember where he's buried, it's an important piece of the puzzle. Now, the thing is, they talked about this in the St. Anne's Historical Commission. I attended their meetings as a kind of I was asked to be part of their meetings, and I told them, I said, our perspective from my brother and myself and from Earl is that we should have a stone, some sort of marker, if it could be located. The irony is that in 2004 we were there in that spot. We just didn't know that he was buried there. Their funeral, or their burial records rather, were burned in a fire. And so we went to that church after we went to the city of Philadelphia archives, and we saw that he was buried at the church. And because their cemetery records were burned, they didn't think they could find anything. Well, as an ecclesiastical archivist, I said, you must have a parish register from then. So they said, oh, yes, we do. So they brought out this ancient parish register, and we paged through there, and lo and behold, boom, X marks not the spot, but they knew that he was buried in a particular lot number. They just didn't know until earlier 2018, later 2017, what that plot number meant for the overall cemetery. We're grateful.
That was a crazy day, going from the Philadelphia City Archives, which is behind Drexel, near 30th Street. And in between, we tried to find M. Night Shyamalan's house, tried to sell him the story. Didn't quite find him, but Earl's talked to his secretary. And then we went to Port Richmond and found Duffy's grave. Crazy day. There is a film being made about Duffy's Cut. The one guy who was interviewed in the our draw burial, John Ruddy, Bill Daly, former VP at Warner Brothers, came up with the idea to make a film, and it is currently being filmed in Ireland with some very A-list Irish actors, and there is a very substantial budget, and I guess we're talking about 6 figures, 7 figures. I don't know. It's a hell of a lot more money than I'll ever. 7 figures.
Yes.
But they swear that they're going to get funding from after the movie comes out to help us do the DNA that we're unable to still get done. I mean, I can't believe it. Some of this is undone, including the other 50 bodies buried at the Cut, which we would like to bury at West Laurel Hill with honors. The only other individual whose name we might get, if there's a 70-year-old man in the work crew, then we have his name. He's Mr. Burns, the father-in-law of
Burns, yeah.
And we'll get him the county Tyrone, just like his daughter-in-law. She was a widow, and they probably came over together looking for her husband, who arrived prior to her arrival here, and predeceased.
They're listed as traveling together. She was a widow, and he was traveling with his widowed daughter-in-law. They came on the same ship. They're linked together in the ship register. a very sad, poignant tale. But we may find that other genetic link. We'll see. But it's fascinating.
Yeah. So you can, we're talking about things, that can be done to commemorate the story of Duffy's Cut. Obviously, the museum, the historical marker, West Laurel Hill, and then St. Anne's with the Duffy grave. There is a kind of circuit you could do, a kind of tour. We took the NEH teachers on that route back in 2016. And there's a whole hidden history of Irish Philadelphia that can be done, as a tour. Again, one of these ideas, you kind of mull it around your brain, you figure out how you can get this thing out there. But also the area in the docks where the Irishmen would have arrived, little remnants, here and there of some of these things. But please, feel free to come on out to our museum, go to West Laurel Hill and see that beautiful Celtic cross, and browse our online store if you have interest in any of these things, like the CD or the books. Any questions from anybody? We'll be happy to try to.
Thank you for that fascinating presentation. I guess for those that are still around, we can ask questions. I'd like to lead off with a question. I'm a fairly skeptical person when it comes to some history things, and I've always found it a little hard to believe that in West Whiteland they could have assembled a mob large enough to attack 57 Irishmen armed with shovels and pickaxes and iron bars and massacre them, and then and not suffer any casualties themselves, and have nobody escape to tell the tale. And the kind of people that would do this are the kind that would get drunk in the local taverns. And how do you keep a conspiracy that large quiet, and especially when there's anti-Irish sentiment, where I would imagine some newspapers would actually brag about this? So
well, there was a cover-up. See, that's the whole point. That
that's
there wasn't
to cover
there
up.
was, but there was a newspaper piece that appeared shortly after the massacre, and the reality is that the entire run of that newspaper disappeared, the Village Record,
and it's the only issue. The only issue to not be anywhere in any archive in North America. We had an idea that they had a complete set of the Village Record up in Scranton, and we had the Immaculata van rented, and there were going to be a bunch of us going up there that day. And I called them. I said, "Can you make sure that issue is in your archives?" He says, "Absolutely not. That was supposed to be the only place that still had the full run. That issue disappeared." And so this article here, November 7th, said that this earlier piece was an exaggeration, and that there were only eight individuals, 8 or 9, who died there, and that one guy ran west in the line of East Bradford and East Collins, where the other site in Downingtown is that we're working at now. But that there was a conspiracy of silence, and that there was an entity. The Pratt family owned the property where Duffy's Cut is located. The Pratt family ran the East Whiteland Horse Company. They were the local vigilantes. We had a guy out of the blue call my office phone in 2016 who said he was a descendant of someone in the horse company in the 1830s, and he knew that his ancestor had done something wrong, and that he wanted to do something right, and that there's a descendants society that meets once a year between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And he wanted to ask them at that opportunity to open up their files to us, because he knew that there was an incident report and that there was a complete list of the members of the East Whiteland Horse Company. And he got back to us eventually, and he said that they closed ranks and said no, that they didn't want us to look at their records because they were afraid of a lawsuit from a collateral descendant of the Irishman over in Ireland. It would be hard to have that hold up in court, but they were afraid that would happen. It would tarnish the image, of course, that their other family members had of this ancestor. So that was not going to happen. But this guy changed his tune when we had him discuss this with one of the filmmakers, and he says, those records don't exist. He was very clear to me, and he was clear to Frank and to Earl when he came out and spoke to the three of us in person, that these documents do exist in their possession, and that there is an incident report and there is a list of the members. And then he went on record with the film guy saying, "Oh no, there isn't anything like that."
The other piece, yes, the other piece of this is that externally in the newspapers, consistently, there's a downplaying of the number of those who died at Duffy's Cut. One piece says 6, another says 8, another says 30. But internally, the railroad admitted that a number as high as 60 men died. And the Duffy's Cut file that we have from our grandfather set the number at 57. So internally, they admit that the deaths of these men happened. Why would they cover up that information and tell a false narrative to the world if there was nothing to hide?
Well, the railroad had every reason to downplay it internally as much as it would have externally. They would have, if the numbers weren't that high, why maintain those numbers inside the railroad all the way up until the time of Martin Clement? They knew in the Pennsylvania Railroad that it was as many as 60 guys, and yet, they maintained that information internally, but not externally. They should have changed it internally, because it would be a matter of time for a railroader himself, like Martin Clement, like our grandfather, would have wanted to bring this out in the wider world. But Martin Clement said, keep this out of the public's eye. And
very first page of the file says, it is not desired to let this file out of the office.
I mean, typically half of any group that gets cholera dies from it. You never have 100% casualties in any group. People are going to run. The only way that this could have become, an entire crew, the guys working in the valley, half of Duffy's crew, the Catholic guys down in the valley, would be by means of some kind of, because it is a valley, that exists in this spot, with the fill being the other side, the north side of it, to contain it and to prevent people from breaking out. Now, there are enforced quarantines in the cholera epidemic of 1832. There are other instances where this kind of thing happened. There are instances
about the German man. Remember the German man, the story that appeared all over the state.
Yeah, and then there's the story, we have this in our book, Massacre at Duffy's Cut, of a similar story of a group of immigrants in Chester County, close to
German.
Duffy's Cut.
German immigrants. Yeah.
But they are. I don't know that the ethnicity of that group.
Yeah, it said it was a German man.
Reference, but it appeared very widely as this story appeared at around the same time. It was slightly later than this story. Individuals who were suspected of having cholera, being hunted down by locals. One man harbored them. Locals killed the immigrants suspected of having cholera and the man who harbored them, and burned the house down. And that appeared in the village record too, with a similar supposed correction, just like this, saying that was just merely an analogy on the Masons. What? And then the editor of the newspaper quits and leaves the area. So there's another shoe that hasn't completely fallen yet.
The story
that got the echo of that fall.
Yeah, that particular story was entitled "Unparalleled Barbarity," and that one snuck out, and it appeared in newspapers in Gettysburg and all over the state of Pennsylvania.
Pottsville was a newspaper up there that had it.
Yeah, but it's just, so this thing is, we know that there was a cover up from the beginning from the railroad, because it would have been a financial crisis both for the railroad and for the state if word got out that there were, besides the fact that there were deaths from cholera, but that there was a massacre. There's reason for them to cover it up in terms of the finances and everything else. But the evidence is clear that you're not going to have 100% mortality with any outbreak of cholera. And so where would the 100, where's the 100% coming from? It just
Janet said for sure that these first 7 were murdered. That makes 7 is a mass murder as much as 57 is a mass murder.
The file tells us that some escaped and then they were forced back into the valley.
We believe that's these first 7 because they all had coffins. And another bit of information about these burials is that the individuals in coffins had about 100 nails on average to seal the lids. Those nails, some of them are on display in our museum. The others are in a cabinet in my office. But you don't typically need that many nails to seal a coffin. And the idea is that they were brought back in and buried in the fill, having been killed off-site, buried by the men who are still healthy, still alive, which becomes the later railroad practice of burying men in the fill. And there are songs preserved in the railroad folklore about bury me in the fill, where I died, and it becomes the later custom. This is the first known example of that, according to John Hankey, the early railroad specialist.
Do you have the image of the Mitchell report handy?
Yeah.
Because I have it. Because that for us, the Mitchell report became very significant. The Mitchell report is a letter by William B. Mitchell, who was a Northern Irish immigrant himself. Here it is. This is from the state archives. And he says that basically the number that he indicates here, that it's a number as high as 60.
It does just say cholera, but of course, again, it's not in his interest to get this out, and nor is it in Duffy's interest to let this get out. I mean, Duffy's an Irishman himself. Duffy's an Irish Catholic, like the workers, but it's not in his best interest to let the full story out because he can't recruit anyone to come after these guys have died. So, I mean, the police out in Chester County who helped us get the marker, the Chester County Emerald Society guys, some of them were detectives like Chuck Crawford. One of them, Matt Gordon, is still with us. He's the chief down in Kennett. And Bob McAllister is on our team, went over to Ireland in 2015 with Catherine Burns. They all said that there's a smoking gun here, that you could take somebody to court for this in civil court, but not possibly not criminal court, without the testimony of the horse company. If you were to go back in time, of course, again, this is far beyond any kind of statute of limitations. Although there's no statute of limitations on a murder, you can't accuse somebody, you can't convict anybody, and put them in jail for this now. That's what the guys in the Descendant Society of the Horse Company don't quite get. That the only thing that's at stake is the reputation of their ancestor, and so this guy, who came forward with this, was very credible. That he's involved in the Descendant Society, and he wanted to open up these records, and the rest of the guys said no way, they weren't going to allow this to happen. So until that happens, or some other chest in an attic somewhere in Chester County opens up with some, for example, a copy of that October 3rd, 1832 village record, there can be speculation one way or the other. But again, the first 7 were murdered. Janet says 100%. She's got 10,000 skeletons down there at the Penn Museum to experiment on.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
When you have a mass murder such as you've uncovered, what usually you would think that they would be like sardine buried. And
yeah, well, we think the rest of them were actually, that the only ones who got coffins are the ones who had to be brought back in. Now, this corresponds also with the newspaper piece that says that only 8 or 9 guys died, the local piece. Nobody could dispute that at the time because everybody in the town would have seen these coffins being borne down from the home where we believe these guys were killed, which would be the home of the local judge, Cromwell Pierce, whose descendant, by the way, I met at a DAR talk on Duffy's Cut in 2009 after we found John Ruddy. And she confirmed to me that the family has information that he depended on the horse company to get elected, and then they depended on him to cover up whatever excesses might have happened in the horse company, because they could do anything they wanted, really, as long as they had the approval of the local judge. But the idea that the first guys got buried properly, and the file describes, that the blacksmith buried these guys, whereas the others, no. I mean, they would have, according to our geologist, he thinks that the rest of those bodies were buried in there's a gully that runs down the middle of the valley, and that entire western area of the fill is where he believes that the other bodies were. And because that fill no longer exists, it was used to expand the track line farther to the north, that those skeletons were moved by one of the guys in this picture here, Patrick Doyle, who was the Pennsylvania Railroad employee who put up the wooden fence that you see here, which is where the stone monument is today. So Patrick Doyle would have found those bodies, moved them to where they are now. And so that's the idea that they would have been like more or less like a Civil War mass grave or a Napoleonic War mass grave, just thrown in. But the first guys, nah, because they'd been killed off site, brought back in, and then buried, accordingly. And that's the view of our geologist as well.
Yeah. A second question I have, of the 7, you said that it was kind of like they were, ropes and handcuffed or whatever. Was there any evidence that their limbs were tied together and when you excavated them?
Yeah, now just that there were no defensive wounds on individuals who had been very violently killed. So that normally you'd put your hands up to try to defend yourself. There was none of that at all.
Right. Janet Monge said that it was very typical. This is very typical of a murder, of a group of individuals murdering a smaller number of individuals.
She said it looked to her like the cut. They have bodies, by the way, of some of the troopers from Custer's unit from the Little Bighorn, and she said the injuries are reminiscent to her of those wounds.
Wow. Good question. I mean, these are all good questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's the other part of this story is in the in a trunk somewhere in Chester County, and hopefully someday we will find that October 3rd, 1832 village record. And hopefully someday we'll get the testimony from the horse company descendants as well. But until then, obviously there will be questions. But these wounds are very clear to Janet.
Oh, yeah.
She said that if they had cholera, that is not what killed them. And this guy, of course, had a bullet in his head. If you come to our museum, you'll see other bullets found in very close proximity to the skeletal remains.
Yeah, we found in the excavation of the shanty, we found several other bullets of the era, and
the man under the tree had a bullet right in his among his bones.
Yeah, highly significant. Yeah.
Great presentation. Really loved it.
Thanks a lot.
Any other questions? If not, I guess we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you, Frank and Bill, for that wonderful presentation. We'll see everybody next Tuesday.
Thanks for having us. And don't forget to check out the website.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.